You are now listening to Asking for a Friend with TalkDoc, sharing insights through real, honest, and practical ways to improve your communication and relationships. Featuring your hosts, Dr. Pamela Kreiser, Meredith Edwards-Nagel, and Teighlor Polindo.
Hello, everybody. Teighlor, TalkDoc, and our guest, Mr. David Leonard. Pleasure to have you. Pleasure is an interesting word for the subject of the conversation today, but we're really looking forward to your time and your insight on the topic of grief. To start, tell us a little bit about yourself professionally and how you got involved in the world of grief.
Well, first off, thanks so much for having me and allowing me to be here in your presence and to share a bit about my own journey and kind of, as you alluded to, the world of grief and how we define that, what that looks like. As you might suspect, that working in the field of grief, one has probably experienced grief or a lot of loss. And so I don't think any of us go to college or school with the thought that when I grow up, I'm going to work at a grief center. I don't think we set out with that in mind. And so for me, it was exactly that. It was my own loss and my own grief that led me into this work. My pain was able to become my passion. And through that, to be able to serve, whether it be a grieving child or a grieving teen or an adult or a widow or someone who's lost a child, that is where I find joy, believe it or not, in seeing people's lives that are completely shattered, restored, right? And so I think that grief really is a beautiful mess. And I've had my own beautiful mess and continue to do so. And so being able to blend my mess with other people's mess as they journey through their grief, I think begins to put the pieces back into perspective, and we end up with this beautiful mosaic, right? Mm-hmm. Because no two grief stories are the same. And when someone dies, if we've experienced catastrophic loss, we are never the same, right? We are completely shattered. And so that idea of the mosaic is that it's kind of like broken pieces made whole. And then if I'm being fully transparent, for me, the major loss I experienced was the loss of my mom. So my parents early on were great. And my childhood was great till I was about 10. And my mom battled with addiction, opioids. That was kind of her thing. And unfortunately, when you're in that mindset, when you're in that way of living, you don't make the greatest choices. Thankfully, my father did something really brave and knew that he had to protect me and took the step to divorce my mother and got full custody of me, which was really rare in the 80s, late early 90s. He was a union electrician, 40 years, blue collar, like wore coveralls every day. I mean, right, just this super tough guy who I admire now, but back then, was feared a bit, but in a healthy way. And so he raised me. I'd visit my mom's on the weekend. I was a weekend warrior. But what began to happen is things became parentified for me, right? I slowly began to switch roles with my mom. I'm an only child. When you're a child of a parent who has an addiction to like opioids, you become parentified and your roles slowly begin to change and you exchange them. And so on past 10 in my teens and in my early 20s, I was really raising my mom. As I shared, my parents were divorced. And so I was doing everything I could. I was trying to go to school, right? I was trying to find my own identity and make my own way in the world and try to figure that out while trying to care for my mother. And so that, as you can imagine, that was really difficult. It was really hard and challenging. So unfortunately, through just a series of bad behavior and choices, eventually my mom ended up in a boarding care center, kind of renting a room. I would try to visit her as much as I could, but with the resources I had and she had combined, that's really all we could afford. And so with my mother being completely isolated most of the time, as you can imagine, that only exacerbated her addiction. And so eventually it took her life. And so there I was, a 27-year-old kid, left to pick up the pieces to figure that out. Sadly enough, my mom had two sisters. None of them made it to 60 years old. They all died chronologically. And so what I realized too, as we talk today, that grief necessarily doesn't even start with just the person who died most recently, right? That you can have this chronic grief, that you can have this generational grief, that if we don't deal with it, can compound. I've always worked in philanthropy or nonprofit in the sector. So after I graduated college, I was working for places like the YMCA here in Long Beach and other places. And I began working with veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan as they were coming back from combat. And one of the needs I didn't think about was that they were coming into my office sharing how they had a ton of survivor's guilt, that it should have been them who died by a roadside bomb, or spouses coming in sharing how dad was already gone on 2 and 3 tours. And we sat anticipating for him or her to come home, and they died. right? And so now they're widowed or widowers trying to figure out and put the pieces back together. Every time I heard a story, it was triggering my own grief, right? I was like, man. So I considered myself to be a high functioning griever, right? I was doing everything the world told me to do. I had a job. I had a girlfriend. I was working out. I was doing all these things. But I knew deep down I was broken. I was grieving, and I was off. So through these veterans who were brave enough to come and tell me about their pain, and keep in mind, a lot of them had PTSD from combat. So you sprinkle grief on top of that, and it's a real recipe for a lot of things. I was able to find a resource for them, and believe it or not, it was then that I discovered New Hope, Grief Support Community, right, where I now work. And the founder, we met for breakfast, and we figured out how we're going to help the veterans. And she looks across the table and she says, and so what are you doing with all your grief? And I said, Ooh. What grief? I don't know grief, right? But her being who she was, her name's Susan Beanie, short of grabbing me by my ear, she said, I'm starting a grief group in a few weeks for young adults, and I want you to be there. And so I went to the group. About 3 weeks in, started learning about their programs. I started volunteering. I volunteered for 5 years. I met a little boy up at a grief camp, and I was down at eye level. And he said, you know, David, he said, you lost your mom and I lost my mom. But together we're going to be okay. And I knew in that moment that I needed to be doing this work. So I volunteered for 5 years with the agency. And then after volunteering in 2012, I came on board as an employee, and I've been here ever since. And now I have the honor and pleasure to serve as their executive director. But I shared by starting with my pain has become my passion. So what's important in this conversation to acknowledge is I use the term high functioning griever. Like there was these things that I thought I should be doing or shouldn't be doing, that as if there's parameters or boundaries around it. I needed to be on my own path and my own journey. But the key to it all is that we don't want to avoid our grief, right? That we want to be in touch with it. We want to hold it. We want to talk about it. We'll talk more about that, I'm sure, down the road.
I'd like to get rid of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And a lot of people do. And we can unpack that a bit more. You know, we suffer in isolation and we find healing in community. And so the key is, where's your tribe? And for me, New Hope was my tribe then and still is now. And we continue to be. But my encouragement is for everyone to find your tribe, whoever that may be, right? That's how I got here. This is how I honor my mom and her legacy and her sister's legacies through this work, bringing hope and healing into the lives of bereaved children and families through connection and support.
Well, thank you for being vulnerable to share that. That's no easy thing with strangers, and thank you.
You're doing the real work out there.
Yeah.
No, thank you.
I know I want to unpack so much of what you said, even though I'm mad now that you already said we can't avoid this. But before we start completely, can you tell us what grief is?
Yeah.
What is this monster that we want to hide or run away from or avoid?
I think it's a lot of things, right? I don't think it's one thing. There's a lot of textbook definitions about it. I think what's important to acknowledge is that that grief has many layers, right? That there's multiple types of grief, what we probably know as, grief, someone has died, right? But then there's also loss. Like for me, my parents divorced when I was 10, that was grief. That was a loss, right? It's this idea that something we have known to be a constant in our lives is no longer there.
Yeah.
And when it's not there anymore, wrapping our heads around that idea and understanding the permanence of that, right? And there's like non-finite grief, and there's anticipatory grief, right? Anticipating someone's going to die or living with a chronic illness. And you keep going through this roller coaster of, they're going to die. I said my goodbyes. Wait. Now they're out of the hospital. What that? That wasn't supposed to happen. But I've already said my goodbyes. And 3 weeks later, I'm saying goodbye again. There's all these ways and types of grief that exist. But when it comes down to it, it's this idea that we are longing for something that is no longer available. And whether that is in the form of an actual person being gone, and that could be because of death, that could be because maybe they got incarcerated, that could be because they abandoned you, right? There's a lot of reasons why people disappear. And then I think it's also this idea of, like, for example, non-finite grief is this idea when our hopes and dreams don't turn out the way we thought they would, when our lives don't turn out the way that we thought they would, right? I didn't expect my mom to die. I didn't expect my son never to know his grandma. I didn't expect my mom not to be at my wedding. Those are all things that are shattered, right? And that's a form of secondary losses that come with grief. So I think for us to try and define grief and put it in a box would really be unfair to those listening. Because to those that are listening, we say the greatest grief is the one you're experiencing right now.
Yeah.
And so wherever people find themselves in the middle of that storm, and the thing that's making them cry or be angry around the thing that is no longer there to be loved or touched or felt or experienced, is the greatest grief that they have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You mentioned being a high functioning griever.
Yeah.
That made me think that there would be an end to it. So if you did the work, then the grief would end. You wouldn't have to be a high functioning griever anymore. Is there an end to it? Is it something that starts and finishes?
Yeah. So I made that term up. I just want to be very clear. That is not like in a textbook
Yeah.
anywhere. That was just something I coined for myself because that's how I felt. What I want to demyth and debunk is this idea that there is no timeline on grief. Grief doesn't have an end point. We ourselves are just learning to redefine our relationship to the deceased or to the thing that's missing, and redefining our lives in a way that hopefully becomes meaningful someday. You know, my mom died, then I got married, and I'm like, hold up. My mom's not at my wedding. And I didn't mention to you guys, my father was with a woman after my mother for 25 years. She was in my life, and she got colon cancer, and she died 3 years after my mom died. So I kind of had like these two big motherly role losses. And I remember sitting at the baby shower thinking to myself, well, if my bio mother can't be here, and then Carol can't be here, what the heck? And I just remember just started crying, and I love it. I remember I had to leave. You know, when you're sitting there and all the presents are there and all the eyes are on you and you're wrapping them and you're writing down the list of who gave what? That's when I lost it, because it hit me like, man, my mom's never going to meet my son, and my son's never going to meet my mom. Now that was 11 years after she died. So I share this to illustrate that grief never ends.
Yeah.
We are constantly evolving and changing as humans. And what's happening is the grief is still there. But as our relationships change, as our jobs change, as our lives change, as the world changes, we are moving through it, but our grief is still with us. But it may not be as intense as it once was. It may not be there every single day of our lives. Doesn't mean we don't think about the person. Doesn't mean we don't open up their diary and read it to be reminded of thoughts that they had. But the intensity of it is changing, and we're growing and evolving with it. So to answer your question, Teighlor, no, it doesn't end.
Dang it.
I know.
Yeah. Go
So
ahead,
can
sir.
we at least speed it up?
Well, before you jump to speeding up, you said that about intensity. I never thought about it like that. And, you know, you can't help when you think of grief to think of your own. Would the less intensity be a sign of healing or working through grief?
No, because check it out. Kubler-Ross was like known like as the godmother of grief. Kubler-Ross wrote what she wrote for the dying patient. That idea of dabda, right? Whether you're in denial or bargaining or acceptance, all those things, anger. But the reality is that those are not linear. We actually do a disservice by using the words like stages or phases. Dr. William Warden, he has many years in the grief field. That's a lot of what our work is based off here at New Hope. He talks about the 4 tasks of mourning. And tasks can be done in any order. And so what was happening, like 80s and 90s, people were thinking dabda in the stages. Well, I did denial, I did anger, I did bargaining. Now I'm moving towards acceptance. I'm almost done with my grief. But what happens is then you wake up one morning and you just feel like crap. And that grief, those waves of grief are just crashing on you like waves on a shore. And so what happens is you think, oh, I must be failing. I'm a failure in my grief. Because now I'm back in denial. I'm not accepting the permanence of the loss. So I must be a really bad, jacked up human being. When it's the complete opposite.
Yeah.
You're actually being fully human, right? Because when you lose something of that magnitude, someone you love, something you care about, or a dream that's crushed, this is our body's natural response. I want to be very clear that they're not stages, right? That it is not linear. We can experience these, Meredith, at any given point along our life or continuum. And it's important to note, too, that when new loss occurs or new death, that triggers old death. And if we didn't have time to process the previous loss, you best believe that when the new loss occurs, it's going to hit you like a ton of bricks. And it's going to rip the Band-Aid off the old loss. And that's why, it's important that as we're grieving, I talked about tribe, right? And that we suffer in isolation and we find healing in community. And it doesn't mean that there can't be times where you're alone. That's perfectly okay, right? Some people, they like to be alone and have their thoughts to themselves or journal or meditate or whatever it is they're doing. At New Hope, we have a peer support model. That's our whole model. It's a peer support model led by people who have all had losses. And that's why it works. It's our secret sauce. But it's the power of the nod. If you've never lost a daughter or a son, for you to even begin to try and have empathy for that, or to try to be like, understand what that other parent is going through, it's very difficult. But when you can gather with those who experience that same pain and that same grief, we call it the power of the nod. So as you're sharing and you can look across the circle like this, knowing that they get it. I don't need to explain much more, because they're experiencing and have experienced the same thoughts and feelings and emotions and grief to this level that I have.
So then when you're talking about building this support community, this tribe, it sounds like the more similar your loss is, the more likely that support would be felt.
Yeah, I would agree. When in the early days, we had groups just for everybody with general loss. Like there was no categories, right? It was just like, well, you lost somebody. It doesn't matter. You lost your mom, you lost your grandma, your husband, like you just put them in a group. We've learned as we've grown and evolved that we now realize that child loss and loss by suicide are very catastrophic, very different. And so we actually offer child loss groups, we offer suicide loss groups. We still have kind of general groups like, oh, I lost a friend, I lost a cousin, a family member. But we realize that those two are really catastrophic. That word was used for like 9/11, the Holocaust, even Maui recently, right? Like those are catastrophic losses. When you can find folks who've been through similar losses, it is helpful. But it doesn't mean that just because you don't, the people in your tribe, doesn't mean that they still can't support you or help carry that burden of grief as you are on the journey. I think, leading with vulnerability and authenticity is the key to that, right? I mean, connection is everything. It is important to be mindful of how you're showing up for people and in what ways, because it can make a huge difference. Because we've all heard the platitudes, after a funeral, when the cards and the casseroles are done, you're left to sit with your grief. And how many of you, you're at the funeral, especially if you're the griever, and everyone's like, hey, just let me know. I'm here for you. What do you need? I got you, blah, 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 blah. Well, slowly all those people return to their lives, right? And that's when the isolation and the loneliness sets in, especially someone who's been married for 30 years, 25, 10 years, it doesn't matter. It's important that we're teaching people and helping people to understand how to show up. Equally important to help grieving people to understand what is it they need in their grief. So I want to put kind of a hat on it though, right? That it is important to also recognize that when you've had a traumatic loss, when you're experiencing and living with trauma from how the person died, that grief is here and trauma is here, right? So you have grief and trauma is covering it. And it's really important to seek out therapy or counseling so that you can help process and unpack the trauma, so that then eventually you can move to the grief work you need to do to begin to find restoration, hope, and healing on your journey.
You don't get to the grief if you don't address the trauma, like you're describing? Yeah,
it's really difficult. It can be, right? There's like trauma therapy versus grief therapy versus like grief support, right? We have a lot of folks call in, they're not ready because of the circumstances surrounding the death. And so we have a lot of community partners we will refer out so they can go receive that one-on-one therapy. And then when their therapist says they're ready, they can do both. Then they'll come back and join a support group. And we see that a lot. And it's really beneficial because they have both of those spaces to share and to process their emotions associated with their grief.
Yeah, sounds like more work.
Yeah,
it is.
Which I know we need to do it, and that's why we're here and we want to talk about it.
Well,
but it sounds like so much to do, and I can just picture my past self or people I love that are in grief, and it almost makes you a turtle even more. Like to go under your shelf. Now I have to address the trauma on top of this thing.
100, yeah, and Edith Edgar is an author, and she wrote that whatever is not expressed becomes repressed, right? Whatever is not expressed becomes repressed.
Who said that?
Edith Edgar. And as it becomes repressed inside of us, then it begins to manifest itself in behavior, in attitudes, in ways, even physically in our bodies, right? We carry that, and the body keeps score, right? If we're not expressing
Good book.
and processing, right, our body will keep the score. And we see this in a lot of people here and afar, that when we're walking around with all this grief and trauma and all these things, especially think post-pandemic and all the things we've all lived through, we were not created nor designed to carry the weight of all that, right? We're just not built that way. You can do it for a while, right? You can put the face on and I'm good, I'm okay. But eventually, if you don't begin to find ways to process it or outlets, whether it be through creativity, meditation, whatever it is that works for you, therapy, support groups, exercise, whatever, it will eventually catch up with you. And I can tell you that, right? I mean, that's why I came up with that idea as a high functioning griever. I was like, I got this. But I knew deep down that I was totally off. And I knew by witnessing those veterans and what they were going through, self-medicating, they were getting divorced, like all these things were happening to them. I was like, man, I don't want to end up in that place. So I had to really do some soul searching and really start thinking about what were the choices I was making? What was my behavior looking like? How were the relationships that I was engaging in either benefiting from how I was investing in them, or was I hurting them? And so what I began to realize is that some of the people that I cared and loved deeply were not getting the best version of me because I wasn't willing to put in the work and invest in myself to really address and face the grief that I had from my mom. And if I continued on that path, there would have been opportunities that I could have missed out on, or relationships, or people, or jobs, or things. I felt like I owed it to myself in the future version of me to put the work in, so that I could even be in a headspace today to be having this conversation with you. Because had I not put the work in 15 years ago, I don't know where I would have ended up.
Is it fair to say if you don't put the work in, it's going to creep up and find you somewhere, some way down the line?
I like to say grief waits for you, yeah. Right? Just like because we discussed there's no timeline, and there's no end to it. We really are learning how to adjust to our new normals, our new difference, right? And how do we adjust? How do we have an enduring connection to the deceased while moving forward and making meaning of our lives and redefining who we are? Because we're never going to be when the bond is broken to that person, and sometimes that thing, we have to learn how to live in that new world and what that looks like, right? And so for me, like with my son, it's huge. Like, he knows who Grandma Chris is. I talk about her all the time. I have to find ways and rituals to incorporate her into my life so that he will know who she is, because I believe that in order to know where you're going, you got to know where you came from. Part of even my own still grieving process is making sure that my son understands who his grandma was, who my mother was, and the role that she played in my life and the way she shaped me, both good and bad, so that then I don't carry some of those traits forward, right? And so that there's not this generational paying it forward, right? Because my son could easily get those traits or those characteristics, right? And I don't want that to happen. I told my wife when we got married, it's like, you're entering the marriage with maybe an F-150 worth of baggage. And I'm coming with a 56-foot diesel truck, right? Full of baggage. But the goal is, I hope, that my son can leave our house maybe with a smaller pickup truck, a little, or maybe a hockey bag would be nice.
You would love Teighlor's version of this. She always tells me, you know what? If our kids need 50% of the therapy that our parents gave us, we're doing something right.
That's Dr. K's. She says, what is it? We're not trying to say we're not doing any therapy. We're just trying to limit the sessions.
Yes. Yeah, you're right.
The requirements of sessions that we're going to need.
How many they're going to need going forward. They're going to need some, but hopefully not as much as we did.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
So you talked about the body keeping score, and you talked about some ways that you might socially have consequences like divorce or different things. Going back to the physical manifestation of grief, is it every kind of manifestation? Is it a certain type? Do you get headaches, or you can't sleep, or what's the physical scorecard look like?
Yeah, all those things you just mentioned. Every grief journey is unique. No two are the same. They're as unique as the thumbprint. When you have a family and the mom or dad dies, and let's say there's 3 or 4 siblings, each of their relationship to that parent is different, and vice versa, right? There's a saying that no kid has the same 2 parents and no parents has the same kid, right? And that's because the relationship is just so different. And so the loss is going to hit different. Grief can affect us in many ways, right? And if you already have pre-existing conditions, like maybe you have depression or anxiety or other things, I mean, it's just going to exacerbate them. We've heard a lot of things over the years, people reporting to us how they're feeling their grief manifest in a physical way.
And I imagine it affects a lot of social aspects of your life, of course. I'm wondering if there's things you should say, you shouldn't say. I think you mentioned that life kind of goes on for everyone else and you feel like you're still in this big event. What happens when you feel like you can't bring it up anymore? Everyone's kind of tired of hearing. What's the advice you have for people?
Yeah, that's great. We as a culture don't do a great job at caring for those who are grieving, right? I mean, historically, culturally, you look at how we used to do things, up until, the late 1800s, early 1900s, people died at home. And their bodies were at home for a few days, and we ate food and celebrated. And then we began to learn about health. And then you have the introduction of funeral homes and parlors. And then we kind of took it back in behind these closed doors, right? We took it behind a curtain and kind of mystified it all, and not knowing about cremation and burial. When before it was all done in the home, and people could touch the dead and hug the dead, and they'd party with the dead. And then that doesn't happen anymore. I share that because, again, culturally, we don't know how or what to do or say. And I think what I want to share is that it's really important for us not to neglect the grieving. I think their greatest fear, and I know especially for grieving parents, is that their son or daughter's name will be forgotten. Mm-hmm. We have a quote here at New Hope. We have these little pins that says, say their name. And so I always encourage people, like, don't be afraid to say their name, like lean in. Don't be afraid to say, how's your grief today? Like just asking. So a lot of times we'll just say, oh, how's it going? I hope you're doing, are you doing fine? I'm doing, but I think just ask a really pointed question of, how's your grief today? Mm-hmm. Or how's your grief been over the last few weeks? How have you been doing since your husband Charles died? Name, like insert name, being mindful of like, he had a life and he had a name and they had a marriage, or your son or your daughter, whatever. If you know the name, say it. I think especially in workplaces, the fear is by us bringing it up, we're going to make them feel worse. Guess what? They already feel bad. They're already grieving. Mm-hmm. Like we're not going to push them into a place of like more hurt or more pain. Anything we hear over and over again, how people want to be talking about it. They want to be acknowledged and affirmed in their pain, in their grief. And they love when people ask them or inquire about it. I think another good thing to ask too is not just focusing on the pain, but also asking them, recently we had a volunteer and she had a loss, and I didn't know the person who died, but I responded with, I'm sorry for your loss. When you have some time, or if you have the energy, I would really love to hear a story about them. Immediately, I got an email back with photographs, all these paragraphs about who they were, about life adventures. I mean, they were just ready. And at the very end, they're like, thank you so much for asking about them. So I think we want to create sacred space for people to have the opportunities to talk about their loved ones beyond the funeral. We need to be okay with just being great listeners and holding that space. A lot of times we say platitudes. Oh, they're in a better place. Oh, they're going to be okay. Oh, you've heard them all. Don't say those things. Just shut up. Just shut up.
That's really good advice.
And I think here's the problem. We are all uncomfortable with silence. And I think what we need to get better at is being comfortable with uncomfortable silence. We teach our facilitators that lead group, number one, get super comfortable with silence. Just sit in it. Just sit in it. And that's okay. Because grieving people don't need to be fixed. They're not broken. They may be brokenhearted, but they're not broken. We need to realize that, and we need to realize, how are we showing up for them? Oh, I tell grieving people all the time, everyone told you at the funeral, I'm here for you, but that was too overwhelming because you were in the thick of it. Now you're 30 days out, 60 days out, 90 days out. Have you considered writing a list of things you might need in your grief? Maybe you need someone to run by the store and get you some milk, or you need someone to take your kids to school. Get to pull the grief card. Could you just drop off a double, animal style with a Neapolitan shake, fries well done, and just like leave it on the porch?
That's an In-N-Out burger for our listeners that aren't as lucky to get In-N-Out as the rest of us.
Yeah.
But if you come to the United States, you need to order that.
Yeah.
I think the other side of that is like self-care, but inviting people into self-care who have a hard time doing self-care for themselves. So it's like, hey, I'm going to pick you up. Let's go get a mani-pedi. Or, hey, I'd love to plan an opportunity for you to have 3 or 4 hours to yourself. Can't imagine what it must be like now having to do everything in the house. If you're comfortable with it, I'd be willing to watch your kids for a few hours so that maybe you can go out and just have some me time and do whatever you want. Or you can stay home and take a nap, and I can take the kids out for a few hours of fun. So I think really just getting really practical with it, and not being afraid to offer, and letting the person themselves either receive that support or reject it. But at least we're making the effort versus doing nothing or saying nothing.
Well, I hear that platitude a lot from funeral attendees. So they'll say, let me know, very vague, very general. Mm-hmm. And what I'm hearing you say is, if you're really going to be the supportive tribe, you've got to follow up and say, is there a meaningful way I can get involved with you that will help this situation even for a minute?
Well, yeah, absolutely. And I think we say those platitudes for our own comfort. because we feel like we don't know what to do or say. So we say it because we need to feel better about ourselves in the moment. When in fact, we're probably doing a lot more harm. So you're absolutely right. We need to dig in a little. When someone dies, there's like this inner circle of people that are affected. And then there's like this outer circle. There's a lot of people that show up to funerals and stuff because it's the right thing to do. But really, the ones that are going to be really impacted, you know, the immediate family, that circle's pretty small. It's about being intentional about who they are and understanding what their needs might be and anticipating those needs and then leaning into those and doing it. Yeah, but the funeral, it's so overwhelming that day. And there's still a lot more to do, right? Especially if you're going to a celebration of life, then we're going to have food, or we're going to a restaurant, then we're going to someone's house, or we got to go to the graveside, and then we got to do a burial. That's definitely not the day to be offering like things. Put the death anniversary in your phone. Put the loved one's birthday in your phone. Tell Siri or whatever you use to remind you to check in on the person in 10 days. Send them a card. Send a text. And even at the end of the text message, put, and you don't need to respond. Just know I love you. Know I'm thinking about you. Because sometimes we send those text messages and then they don't respond. And then we're like, now we're all upset. Like, why didn't they respond? I offered to do this and that.
Or on the reverse, I think the grieving person, at least in my experience and people I love know, they feel guilty for not responding. Or then they go through that, like, I'm grateful, but like, do I have to respond to everyone? I don't know what to do now, you know?
Yeah, but each person's different. It's not a one size fits all. However, we have to do a better job at moving the needle and how we're caring for the grieving in our community. And it really is isolating, you know, especially when we think about elderly, those who've been married for decades and are now trying to figure out life on their own, and their kids have moved out. But the same could also be said, like I described, of a newly married parent or mom or dad who that's this idea. I mean, not only is it grief, I talked about non-finite grief. No one as a young mother or father expects that their spouse is going to die when their kids are young. And now you're left to figure out this life on your own. So many layers to our grief to consider.
Do you think grief is worse after the pandemic? We've all had sort of this collective loss of our life as we knew it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, during the pandemic, people had lots of losses. But when we talk about death loss, the hard part about that is all the rituals were taken away. Or whatever your culture is, like you weren't able to bury your loved one or celebrate your loved one because of the pandemic, because of social distancing and those things. And so really that prolonged your ability to celebrate and honor that person's life. And then we were all trying to figure it out through screens and other ways. And it just wasn't resonating or working the same. And so we've seen a lot of people reaching out to us after the pandemic.
You said earlier, connection is so important in your grief. And it sounds like that there was such disconnect.
Huge disconnect, right? Both culturally and then to the people who you would celebrate with. There's these rituals and things we do. And now, you know, and even thinking about COVID, it's like, you know, saying goodbye over a screen, right? On a laptop, on a tablet, like a nurse is holding it up. And you're like, oh, bye, mom, bye, like, bye, whoever, right? You can only imagine. And then you don't even get to have it, or maybe you don't get to see the body. There are all these things at play. So fast forward, I mean, they eventually and hopefully got to do some sort of celebration of life, but it was all prolonged. It looked very different. People who maybe they were hoping would be there weren't able to be there. And so now they're left trying to journey alone. So the statistics are the childhood estimation bereavement model. It comes out of a place called Judy's House in the JAG Institute in Colorado. They have kind of done a lot of research around childhood bereavement. Nationally, 1 out of 14 kids between the ages of 0 and 18 will lose a biological parent or sibling before the age of 18. And the number doubles to about 1 in 7 between 18 and 25 that they'll lose a biological parent or sibling. So when you extrapolate that out across the country, I mean, you're looking at a large number of youth who are going to be bereaved. That's not taking into account, we have a lot of families who are multi-generational, living under one roof or in a duplex. When we get into urban settings, when we have dense population, like I'm here in Los Angeles, the Long Beach area, a lot of density. If an uncle or grandma or some other family figure who lives with you under your roof were to die, that would have huge implications for you, especially for youth. So those numbers only account for bio, parents, and siblings. When you start to think about the number of youth who are actually grieving, who lost a parent over the pandemic, who could have lost more loved ones since then, grief is a public health issue that has been long overlooked. And if we don't start really stepping up our game, like as a grief center and a guy who works in grief and loss, I'm seeing the impact of it on our youth academically, socially, mentally, spiritually, physically, you name it. So that's why everything I'm doing is really for grieving children and families, right? Whether we're providing support groups, we're going into schools, we're doing parent-teacher workshops to help them understand how to best support grieving youth. So really trying to move the needle and educating the public on how do we support grieving youth? How do we support ourselves? How do we support adults? I'm grateful to you guys because I think it starts with conversations like this and really trying to normalize grief in our society. It's become so taboo and we don't want to talk, and we want to get right through it. And we want to put it behind us and we don't want to touch it. But the reality is, as I've shared, there is no timeline, but you cannot avoid your grief. It's going to wait for you. I'm not saying everybody's going to need grief support because some people have really great support systems and they have great tribes already and they're going to be just fine. But there's a large amount of the population, especially children, who don't have the coping mechanisms yet. Developmentally, their brains aren't there yet. They need adults in their lives. And where do kids learn how to grieve? From the moms and dads and adults in their lives. Right. And so when we ourselves can be vulnerable and lead on what it looks like to grieve. So when I hear a lot of parents say, well, I don't want to cry in front of my kids, or I don't want to grieve because then I'm weak. I feel, I'm going to make them sad. But I tell them, no, I said, it's the complete opposite. By you doing that, you're giving them permission to grieve. There's 3 things we say in grief. You're not going crazy. Everything you feel is normal and you have permission to grieve. Right. And so when we as adults grieve in front of kids, they're then learning what it looks like. So you can be ugly crying, mocos, the whole 9 yards, but then 5 minutes later, okay, now we're going to soccer practice, or we're going to have dinner, or I'm going to help you with your homework. And they can see you go here, into the valley and then back up to a peak. Because
Can you
that's
say
how
those 3 things again? What were those 3 things?
You're not going crazy. Everything you feel is absolutely normal and okay. And you have permission to grieve, despite what the world or your friends or family might tell you. And I think that's the big thing. We need to be giving permission for people to grieve when and how they need to. Mm-hmm. And I think we don't do that enough. So again, I'm grateful for you guys allowing this conversation, because to the listeners out there, if you are grieving, first of all, I'm sorry, right? But I hope that today you heard something that encourages you to want to lean into your grief, and that you have permission to grieve and to seek out people in your circle and your sphere that can help you carry that grief and that burden, and to know that even if you feel a little bit crazy, that's okay, but that you can experience hope and healing and restoration. And one day, maybe not soon, but one day again, you will be able to make meaning of your life. It'll look different, but I can tell you, having come from a really hard place and in some really dark days, that if you do it and you put the work in, I think you will be pleasantly surprised by how that beautiful mess can begin to manifest into something whole again.
Thank you for saying that. And is it fair to say also that your tribe wants to carry that with you?
Yeah. So there's 2 people have usually two dominant grief styles. One's intuitive and one's instrumental. Instrumental grievers are the doers, right? They're the ones planning the funeral and the food and the catering. But then even weeks after, you'll find them like gardening or going, like really throwing themselves into work. But then you'll have someone in the family who's more of an intuitive griever. So they're like really emotional, maybe they're crying all the time or whatever emotion they're crying. Well, they're each looking at each other saying, you're not grieving. One's saying, you're too emotional. You're like crying all the time. And they're looking at the other and saying, you're not grieving at all. You're like just going back to work. You're painting fences, right? You're doing all these things. But the reality is they're both grieving in their own way. It's intuitive versus instrumental. But what happens is we want to compare our grief, right? And I think the same with our tribes. If you can kind of identify what your grief style is, that can then interpret to how you might encourage your tribe to support you, right? And if they know that about you, what your dominant kind of grief style is. And really, it's like a pendulum. We can also swing between both of those. Our previous clinical director, he had lost his wife of many years, and their goal was to remodel the kitchen. And so after she died, he like threw himself into the kitchen and was like remodeling the kitchen for like several months. And everyone's like, he's not grieving. But the reality, he was grieving. By remodeling that kitchen, it was helping him, but it was also honoring his wife. I think it looks different for everyone, but communication is key to your tribe and letting them know what you need.
I also heard this danger of comparison, whether that's the style of grief. So I grieve differently, so you're not doing it right, or you didn't care as much, or I cared more, or you cared more. You've said a few things about timelines as well, where we might say to someone, you should be over this by now. And it sounds like that's a really dangerous place that we could end up in, where we're, for some reason, deciding it should last this long and you should be better by now, or it should look this way and you don't look this way. You're doing grief wrong.
Exactly.
It's like a double wrong.
It's a double wrong. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we got to give people that permission to grieve in their own timeline. Who are we to say you're done or not done, right? Be mindful. And I think less is more when it comes to these things.
Thank you. Do you have any thoughts, or not that they have to be last, but any that you think would be just super important for someone to hear that could be in their grief, or a supporter of grief, somebody that's grieving, that you hope just is like, if this is one thing you hear this?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I'll lean back on just that idea that giving yourself permission to grieve, that this is an absolutely normal response, right? That this is grief is the great unifier, right? It levels the playing field. Grief does not discriminate. It doesn't care about income, race, color, religion, creed. It doesn't care about any of that. This is the one thing everybody is going to experience. And so I think allowing yourself permission and recognizing that however you're feeling or responding to your loss is okay and normal. Making sure that you're taking care of yourself. And if you are feeling as if I'm not okay, not being afraid to reach out and ask for help, right? Whether that's joining a support group or seeking therapy or leaning into your tribe. The resources are out there. And so my encouragement is just, seek them out and know that that's okay.
So what resources would you recommend in terms of books or podcasts or? Yeah,
I'm a friend of, there's two really great girls. They lead a movement, I'd call it. It's called What's Your Grief? And they do great stuff, a lot of great online resources. You catch them on Instagram. They got a great following. What's Your Grief? There's another one I like called Modern Loss. They do a lot of great work. If you are a parent listening and you're concerned about your child, the National Alliance for Grieving Children is great, NAGC. I am a member of that. We do great work. It's a collection of all the grief centers from across the country who are working with grieving children. Lots of resources you can find there in multiple languages. And of course, your local grief center, wherever you find yourself, whatever zip code you're in. If you just type in grief support near me or grief therapist near me, you'll find that. With grief support, I'd say trust the process. Probably seems really weird. You're going to show up to a room full of strangers and share your whole, the hardest part of your life. But again, they are in it too. Ironically, they all actually become your really best friends. That's what we hear all the time. They become their grief tribe. So yeah, those are some really good ones that I am a fan of and glean a lot of wisdom and knowledge from them. They're definitely what I'd consider to be thought leaders in the space.
Someone would find you, they would say grief center near me, and if they were in your area, would your organization pop up then?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we're New Hope Grief Support. It's newhopegrief.org. You can find us. We're in the kind of LA, Long Beach area in California. But again, I know of lots of great grief centers across the country. As we say when we gather, there's enough grief to go around. We are not competing. We want to be able to wrap our arms around all those who want our services. The other one I'd mention too for listening parents is experience camps and Camp Aaron. They got some day camps and some week-long camps that are free of cost for children to go with other grieving kids to a camp and do a lot of camping activities and experience while processing their grief and emotions through a lot of art and camping activities. So we do a lot of referring to them. We've come a long way, I'd say, in the last decade when it comes to how we're providing grief support for children and youth. And we're really starting to move the needle with adults as well. I'm hopeful that anyone who wants to be supported will find something that meets their needs. Because I said, it's not a one-size-fits-all.
And David, thank you so much for
thank you.
Just being real about this. I think you're right. There's just a lot of cheap things to say. And I just appreciate you helping us know how to avoid those things, how to shut up, and also how to not, if you're a grieving person, ways to get support. And yeah, I never really thought about how it doesn't discriminate. That's going to stick with me.
Yeah, it sure doesn't. Like I say, it's the great unifier. I think that's what I love about grief work too, to be honest, is that when we gather families or adults or children, or when we go into school, you see them come. One of the first questions we'll ask children is, when they come in the group, it might be, 10 or 12 students, first through third grade or third through fifth or middle schoolers. It's like, how many of you knew that the others in the circle had lost someone special? How many of you knew that? And they're like, I had no idea. How many of you thought you were the only person on campus that lost someone special? And they're like, they raised their hand. And so it doesn't matter in that moment if they're an athlete, they're into K-pop, they're skateboard. It don't matter what they're into. Like immediately the walls come down. The grief is what unifies them because they are all on that same journey. And so I think that's what I love about it. The beauty of it is that it brings everyone together because we will all at some point in our lives be a part of this club, right? And it's a club none of us want to be a part of, but we will all have a membership someday. So yeah, thank you guys so much again for shedding light on this subject. I think it's really important, and we don't want people to suffer in isolation, but we want them to find healing in community. I think continue to educate yourselves. If you're listening, there's a lot.
Yeah, thank
but
you.
I know, and I know that's like drinking from a fire hose, but
We need it.
We'll listen to it over and over.
Yeah, this will be a replay for me for sure.
Definitely.
Yeah, but thank you, David, for all of your insight and, of course, for your good work.
Yeah.
Important work that makes a difference, and we really are thankful for that.
100%. Yeah, thank you.
oh, well, thank you guys so much for all that you're doing to raise the profile of a lot of good conversations and topics that need to be addressed in today's day and age. So appreciate all of you, and I wish you all the best.
You made it. David,
All right.
thank you so much. That
Thank
was,
you.
yeah, I liked the
Amazing.
fire hose. It's a replay for me. I'm
all wet now, but
Yeah.
fine. I'll dry off, I guess.
Oh,
Oh,
I'm so glad we're still recording. I love you guys.
yeah, that's a classic right there.
Once again, thank you for joining us today. Please remember to rate, share, and subscribe to our podcast. And thank you for listening to Asking for a Friend.
Let us know what you thought of the episode. Our email is hello@afafpodcast.com. This show is for educational purposes only and is copyrighted. Written permission must be granted before syndication or rebroadcasting. Thanks for listening to Asking for a Friend with TalkDoc.